Then, when it was the 17th night, she continued, I have heard, O auspicious king, that when the lady of the house stood before the caliph, she said, Mine is a strange story. The two black bitches are my sisters. 3 of us were full sisters, and these 2, the doorkeeper and the housekeeper, were born of a different mother. When our father died, each of us took her share of the inheritance. Some days later, my mother died, leaving us 3,000 dinars, and so each of us, I being the youngest, inherited 1,000 dinars. My sisters were thus equipped with dowries and each married. Their husbands stayed for a time, but then they collected trade goods and, each of them taking 1,000 dinars from his wife, they all went off on a voyage together, leaving me behind. They were away for 5 years, during which time the men lost their money and were ruined, abandoning their wives in foreign parts. After 5 years, my eldest sister came to me in the most squalid of states, dressed as a beggar, with tattered clothes and a dirty old shawl. When I saw her, I didn't recognize her at first and took no notice of her. Then, realizing who she was, I asked her what had happened, but she said, It is no use talking, sister, the pen of fate has written God's decree. So I sent her to the baths, gave her clothes to wear and said, Sister, you have been given to me in exchange for my father and mother. My share of what the 3 of us inherited has been blessed by God, and it has allowed me to thrive and become prosperous. You and I are equal partners. I treated her with all kindness, and she stayed with me for a whole year. We were concerned about our other sister, but it was not long before she too arrived in an even worse plight than the eldest. I treated her even better than I had treated her sister, and both of them shared in my wealth. Some time later, they told me that they wanted to marry again as they could not bear to remain without husbands. My dears, I said, there is no longer any benefit to be got from marriage, and good men are hard to find now. I don't see any advantage in your proposal, and you have already had experience of marriage. My sisters did not accept that and married without my approval, although I covered all their costs. They then left with their husbands, who very soon afterwards played them false, took all that they had and went off, abandoning them. Once again they came back to me, covered in shame, apologized and said, Don't blame us. You may be younger than us, but you are more intelligent. We shall never again mention marriage, so take us as your slave girls that we may have a bite to eat. Welcome, sisters, I said. No one is dearer to me than you. And I kissed them and honored them even more than before. This went on for a full year, after which I decided to fit out a ship to go to Basra. I chose a large one and loaded it with goods, merchandise, and everything needed for the voyage. I asked my sisters whether they would prefer to sit at home until I returned from my voyage or whether they would like to come with me. We will go with you, they said, as we cannot bear to be parted from you, and so I took them along. I had divided my wealth in 2, taking half with me and leaving the other half behind, with the idea that, were the ship to be wrecked and we survived, there would be something to support us on our return. We sailed for some days and nights, but the ship then went astray as the captain had not kept to the right course, and without realizing it, we were sailing in the wrong direction. This went on for some time, and over a period of 10 days we had fair winds. After that, the lookout climbed up to investigate. He called out, Good news, and came down full of joy and told us that he had seen what looked like a city resembling a dove. We were delighted, and within an hour, we could see the place in the distance. We asked the captain its name, but he said, By God, I don't know. I have never seen it before, and never in my life have I sailed on the sea. But things have turned out safely, and all we have to do is put into harbor. Look out your merchandise, and if you can sell, and then buy up whatever is there. If that does not work, we can rest here for 2 days, buy provisions and go on with our voyage. We put in, and the captain went up to the city. He was away for a time, and when he came back he told us, Come up and wonder at what God has done to those he created, and seek refuge from his anger. We went to the city, and when we came to the gate, we saw that it was guarded by men with sticks in their hands, but when we got nearer we found that they had been turned to stone, while in the city itself we found that everyone had been transformed to black stone and there was no trace of life. We were astonished, but as we threaded our way through the markets, we discovered that the traders' wares and the gold and silver had remained unchanged. This delighted us, and thinking that there must be some mystery here, we split up and walked through the city streets, each concerned to collect her own booty, money and fabrics. I myself went to the castle, which turned out to be strongly fortified, and I then entered the royal apartments, where all the utensils were made of gold and silver. There I saw the king wearing robes of bewildering splendor, seated with his chamberlains, officers and viziers. When I approached, I found that he was sitting on a throne studded with pearls and gems, wearing cloth of gold, with every jewel gleaming like a star. Standing around him were 50 Mamluks, dressed in silks of various kinds, with drawn swords in their stone hands, an astonishing sight. I then walked into the hall of the harem, whose walls were covered with hangings of silk with gold-embroidered branches. The queen was there asleep, wearing a robe ornamented with fresh pearls. On her head was a crown studded with gemstones of all kinds, while around her neck were necklaces of all sorts. Everything she was wearing, dress and ornaments, was unchanged, but she herself had been transformed to black stone. I then found an open door and went up to it. There were 7 steps and these led to a chamber whose marble floor was spread with gold-embroidered carpets. In it there was a couch made of juniper wood, inset with pearls and precious stones, together with 2 large emeralds, covered by a pearl-studded hanging. There was also a door from which I could see a light shining. I went to stand over it, and there in the center on a small chair I found a jewel the size of a duck's egg, burning like a candle and shedding light, while spread over the couch was an amazing array of silks. The sight filled me with astonishment. On looking further, I saw lighted candles. Someone must have lit these, I said to myself, and I then went to another room and proceeded to search all through the building, forgetting myself in my astonishment at all this and plunged in thought. I continued exploring until nightfall, but then, wishing to leave, I found I had lost my way and had no idea where the gate was. So I went back to the chamber with the lighted candles, sat down on the couch, and, after reciting a portion of the Quran, wrapped myself in a coverlet, trying in vain to sleep but becoming uneasy. Then at midnight I heard a beautiful voice reciting the Quran. This filled me with joy and I followed the sound until I came to a small room whose door was shut. I opened it and looked inside, to find a chapel with a prayer niche in which hung lighted lamps together with 2 candles. In this chapel a prayer rug had been put down, and on this sat a handsome young man with, before him, a copy of the Holy Quran from which he was reading. Wondering how he alone had been saved from out of all the inhabitants of the city, I entered and greeted him. He looked up and returned my greeting, at which I said, "By the truth of what you have recited from the Book of God, I implore you to answer my question." He looked at me, smiling, and replied, "Servant of God, do you tell me why you came here and I will tell you what happened to me and the people of this city and how it was that I escaped." So I told him my story, which filled him with wonder, and then I asked him about the townspeople. "Wait, sister," he said, and he then closed the Quran and put it into a bag of satin, before making me sit beside him. When I looked at him, I saw him to be the moon when it comes to the full, excellent in his attributes, supple and handsome. His appearance was like a sugar stick, with a well-proportioned frame. As the poet has said, "To the astrologer watching by night appeared a beautiful form dressed in twin robes." Saturn had granted him black hair, coloring his temples with the shade of musk. From Mars derived the redness of his cheek, while Sagittarius shot arrows from his eyelids. Mercury supplied keenness of mind while the bear forbade the slanderers to look at him. The astrologer was bewildered by what he saw and the ground before him was kissed by the full moon. Almighty God had clothed him in the robe of perfection and embroidered it with the beauty and splendor of the down of his cheek, as the poet has said. I swear by the intoxication of his eyelids, by his waist and by the arrows that his magic shoots, by the smoothness of his flanks, the sharpness of his glance, his white complexion and the darkness of his hair, his eyebrow that denies sleep to my eye, controlling me as he orders and forbids, by his rosy cheek and the myrtle of its down, by the carnelian of his mouth, his pearly teeth, by his neck and by the beauty of his form, with pomegranates showing on his chest, by his haunches that quiver, whether he moves or is still, by his slender waist and by his silken touch, the lightness of his spirit and all the beauty he encompasses. I swear by his generous hand and by his truthful tongue, his high birth and his lofty rank. For those who know of musk, it is his scent, and he it is who spreads the scent of ambergris. Compared with him, the radiant sun is nothing but the paring of a fingernail. The glance that I gave him was followed by 1,000 sighs, and love for him was fixed in my heart. My master, I said, answer my question? Willingly, he replied, and he went on, know, servant of God, that this is my father's city, and he is the king whom you saw sitting on the throne turned into black stone, while the queen whom you saw in the hall is my mother. All the people of the city were Magians, worshipping fire rather than Almighty God. They would swear by fire, light, shadows, the heat of the sun and the circling sphere. After my father had for long been without a son, late in his life I was born to him. He brought me up until I was a grown man, and good fortune always preceded me. With us there was an old Muslim woman who believed in God and his apostle in secret, while in public she followed the practices of my people. My father had faith in her because he saw that she was trustworthy and chaste, and he showed her great respect, thinking that she was his co-religionary. When I grew older he entrusted me to her, saying, "Take him, give him a good upbringing, ground him in the tenets of our faith, and look after him." When she had taken me, she taught me about the religion of Islam with the obligations of ritual purification and of prayer, and she made me learn the Quran by heart, telling me to worship none but Almighty God. When she had done all this, she told me to keep it hidden from my father, and not to tell him lest he kill me. So I kept the secret for a few days. But then the old woman died, and the people of the city sank ever further into unbelief and presumptuous error. While they were in this state, suddenly they heard a mighty voice like the rumbling of thunder, calling out in tones that could be heard far and near, "Citizens, turn away from the worship of fire and worship God, the merciful King." The people were startled, and they all came to my father, the king, and asked, "What is this alarming voice that we have heard, astounding and terrifying us?" "Do not be alarmed or frightened by it," he replied, "and do not let it turn you from your religion." Their hearts inclined to what he said. They persisted in their worship of fire, and they acted even more wickedly until a year had passed from the first time that they had heard the voice. They then heard it for a second time and, after 3 years, for a third time, once each year, but they still clung to their beliefs. Then, at dawn one day, divine wrath descended, and they, together with their animals and their flocks, were turned to black stone. I was the only one to escape, and since that happened, I have been living like this, praying, fasting and reciting the Quran, but I can no longer endure being alone, with no one to keep me company. I had lost my heart to him, so I asked him whether he would go to Baghdad with me, where he could meet the men of learning and the faqihs, and so add to his knowledge, understanding and grasp of religious law. "No," I went on, "that the slave who stands before you is the mistress of her people, with command over men, eunuchs and slaves. I have a ship laden with merchandise, and it was fate that led us here in order that we should see these things, and it was ordained by destiny that you and I should meet." I continued to prompt him to leave with me, flattering him and using my wiles until he agreed to accept. Morning now dawned, and Shahrazad broke off from what she had been allowed to say.